What does it mean to feel complete? To feel at ease with oneself and the world? Is this a conscious state that is truly attainable for humans with our social and evolutionary conditioning? Just how much of our behaviour is driven by a sense of insufficiency with what is, a sense that somehow I am, in my current form, not enough? Where does this feeling derive from? Early childhood learning, societal conditioning, evolutionary heritage? You see, sometimes as children we can learn the lesson that love and acceptance are conditional on us being a certain way, and so we then engage in behaviours that deviate from our natural and authentic self in order so that we may attain conditional regard and affection. Likewise, this may manifest in peer group settings where we create a kind of socially acceptable version of the self that we present and hope will be accepted by others. All this, of course, fueled by the sense that we, as we currently are simply not deserving or worthy of love. Society, with its obsession with image, wealth, success, and beauty, can also feed this pernicious cycle that keeps us perennially dissatisfied with how we are currently. Marketers and advertisement companies will engage in a rather sinister game to inspire some kind of void in the self that must be filled with a particular product or service. Consumer capitalism, of course, creates an embedded obligation to drive people to consume as much as possible. And what better way to do this than by instilling lack and emptiness, which may be filled with consumption. Furthermore, as evolved biological creatures, our motivational machinery will naturally draw us towards certain things we find attractive and away from things we find aversive. This motivational system, as part of its function, can act to instill a sense of craving, a anxious energy which inspires a movement to quell that feeling. Hunger, for instance, will create this drive and a sense of lack which inspires us to seek out and consume food to change one's circumstance currently into something more desirable, i.e. a well-fed belly. In some sense, insufficiency with what is seems to be a deep aspect of the human experience, perhaps something that is unavoidable. However, I would say that deep feelings of sufficiency and completeness are also an aspect of the human experience, even though they may be transient for many of us. You know, when we think about the times where we did feel enough and we did feel complete, what sort of foundation facilitated this? Was it some kind of perfect arrangement of environmental circumstance, some kind of correct action which led to the cessation of emptiness and its replacement with fullness? This correct action, of course, being the various doings and behaviours which we believe will bring contentment, that we believe will bring fullness. But notice how this belief, constructed by thought, implicitly assumes that we are not already complete and full. In the here and now, where you are listening to this video, where is the sense of lack? What element of experience points to an insufficiency? Does the experience of physical pain, emotional suffering, and aversive stimuli indicate a sense of not enoughness or incompleteness in the self? Often these things come with an associated shame, the sense that we shouldn't be feeling this, which then creates this ideal and complete version of the self which lacks the associated negative feelings. This ideal version of the self is, of course, an abstract idea, a kind of model generated by thought. Whenever we act in order to track some kind of idealized version of the self, we are fundamentally dissociated from the self as it currently is. This dissociation, a kind of detachment from the authentic self, is the essence of the feeling of not enoughness. I hope for this video to serve as a reminder to not fall into the trap of requiring external validation to define one's worth. These are fleeting, ephemeral, and ultimately conditioning of completeness. You are already complete by virtue of being an excitation of the universe, a temporary process in a vast ocean of unfathomable complexity. What we often forget is that we are both the temporary process, the incarnation, the being, as well as the vast ocean. True completeness is already there, but it is clouded by a kind of hypnosis that we have a propensity to fall into. This hypnosis is the attachment or identification with thought which sets up the conditions towards which wholeness is pursued. Thought also generates our limiting model of the self, which is split into the individual, something that is distinct and separate to the rest of nature. Of course, this is an illusion of thought. It has the effect of fragmenting our consciousness when we falsely identify with it. When there is no thought, or when there is the cessation or slowing down of thought, what remains? What remains really is something that eludes the approximation of thought and words. We may call it the raw and primordial isness of this. What is important to note is that there is no lack or incompleteness with this wordless quality to experience. All there is perhaps is spontaneous motion, spontaneous excitation of mind with thought, sense, emotion, and feeling. It's like a lake that ripples, and these ripples are the thoughts that come and go. The thoughts are, of course, not separate to the underlying lake. They are the lake and its spontaneous rippling, its spontaneous activity. There is no splitting from nature that thought generates. Thought simply is one of the many activities and movements of nature as it is occurring right now in your particular organism. The natural spontaneity of thought is a beautiful and awe-inspiring thing to glimpse, as it clearly demonstrates that you are not your thoughts. They are excitations, linguistic and verbal processes that simply manifest through you. Whilst it may be their activity in certain moments to sow self-doubt and discontent, remember that this is just another one of thought's spontaneous movements. The deep field or the deep lake from which thoughts arise is never perturbed, it is never rendered incomplete or insufficient by thought, simply because it just is. And this raw isness carries a inexhaustible depth that eludes the limitation of thought. When we identify with the raw isness, that is everything that is manifesting in the here and nowness of the present moment, there is no fragmentation of the self with thought. There is no sense of feeling like an insufficient somebody. What remains really is a deep, spontaneous flow, a deep, spontaneous movement. In this flow, one recognizes their nature as not a separate entity, but as something utterly continuous with everything on the most fundamental level. Because, of course, nature is not comprised of discrete and separable things. There are only continuous and overlapping processes that we split and pass with language and thought. Remember that when we articulate to ourselves that we are not enough, we are splitting the self, creating an unattainable ideal of the self with thought, which detaches us from the already complete and sufficient self, a authentic self that simply just is.